The largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War was a complete American defeat. More men fought on the fields and passes of Long Island on the 27th of August, 1776, than at any other engagement of the Revolution. And Britain had made certain of that long before the first shot was fired. The force that arrived at Staten Island that summer was the largest expeditionary army Britain had ever assembled anywhere on Earth. 400 ships, 32,000 soldiers and sailors. Washington had 19,000 men, many of them sick, undertrained, and poorly armed. What followed was not a contest between equals. It was the most powerful military machine on Earth against a nation that had existed for less than 2 months. 300 Americans were killed that day. Over 1,000 were captured. The Continental Army was pinned against a river with no way out. By every measure that has ever decided a war, American independence should have ended that afternoon. It did not, and the reason it did not has almost nothing to do with fighting. On the 4th of July, 1776, the 13 colonies of British North America did something that had never been done before in the modern world. They declared themselves free, not through negotiation, not through a gradual loosening of ties, but through a direct and unambiguous statement addressed to the most powerful empire on Earth. The document they signed that afternoon was an act of extraordinary confidence and extraordinary risk. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence were not soldiers. They were merchants, lawyers, planters, and physicians. They understood words and commerce and law. What they did not fully understand, what none of them could yet know, was whether the army that would have to defend that declaration was capable of doing so. The ink had barely dried before that question became urgent. The war itself had already begun. Fighting had broken out 14 months earlier at Lexington and Concord, and through the following year the Continental Army had achieved something significant. It had driven the British out of Boston. On the 17th of March, 1776, the last British warships slipped out of Boston Harbor, and Washington's men watched from the shore with a feeling that could only be described as disbelief. They had done it. They had forced the world's greatest military power to leave. That victory carried a dangerous weight. It produced confidence where caution was required. The men who had stared down the British at Boston had done so from fortified high ground, in a siege they understood, against an enemy who had eventually decided the position was not worth holding. It was not the same as meeting a full British offensive in the open field. The difference between those two things would become clear very soon. Washington knew it. Even as his men celebrated the British departure from Boston, he was already thinking about where the next blow would fall. New York. It had to be New York. The city sat at the mouth of the Hudson River, the great water corridor that ran north through the continent to the lakes and beyond. Whoever held the Hudson held the spine of the eastern seaboard. The British understood this as well as Washington did. John Adams had written to Washington in January of that year with the kind of directness that cut through all the noise. New York, he said, was the nexus of the northern and southern colonies, the key to the whole continent. A passage to Canada, to the Great Lakes, to every nation along the frontier. No effort to secure it, Adams wrote, ought to be omitted. Washington needed no persuading. By April, he had already begun moving his army south from Boston. The British plan was clear enough once you understood the geography. 3 armies were to converge on the Hudson River, one moving north from New York City, one south from Montreal, one east from Fort Oswego. If all 3 succeeded, New England would be sealed off from the rest of the colonies. Cut the rebellion at its root, starve New England of men and supplies, and the whole enterprise of independence would collapse. It was a sound strategy. It very nearly worked. New York in the summer of 1776 was a city of roughly 25,000 people, one of the largest in the colonies and by far its most vital port. Ships from Britain, the Caribbean, and the European continent moved through its harbor constantly. Its streets were full of loyalists, men and women who remained committed to the crown and who would prove useful to the British in ways Washington could not fully anticipate. It was not, in any simple sense, a patriot city. Washington arrived to find a problem that could not be solved with enthusiasm alone. The geography of New York was a defender's nightmare. Manhattan Island was surrounded by water on 3 sides. meaning a naval force could land almost anywhere along its length. Brooklyn Heights, across the East River on Long Island, commanded the harbor. If the British seized it, they could fire down on Manhattan at will. Washington had to defend everything and could concentrate nowhere. He split his forces. 3 divisions on the southern end of Manhattan, 1 in the north, and 1 across the East River on Long Island, tasked with holding Brooklyn Heights. It was the logical response to an impossible situation. It was also, as events would show, exactly what the British expected him to do. A divided army is easier to defeat in detail than a concentrated one, and Howe knew it. The men Washington was working with were not, for the most part, professional soldiers. The Continental Army was an army of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers who had taken up arms because they believed in a cause. Some had fought at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill, at the Siege of Boston. Most had not. They were brave in the way that conviction makes men brave. They were not yet disciplined in the way that sustained combat requires. Disease compounded every difficulty. Smallpox had been moving through the army since the campaigns in Canada, and by the summer of 1776 it was thinning Washington's ranks in ways that British muskets had not yet managed to. Of the roughly 19,000 men Washington had on paper, a significant number were too ill to fight. Recruitment suffered for the same reason. Men who might otherwise have enlisted feared the camps more than they feared the redcoats. Washington attempted to manage the outbreak through quarantine, careful movement of infected men, and isolation of new arrivals. He could not inoculate freely. The procedure itself produced a mild form of the disease and could trigger an epidemic in a confined camp. He was managing a war and a public health crisis simultaneously, with tools that were inadequate for both. It was the kind of problem that does not appear in histories of the Revolution, but shaped every decision he made. On the 9th of July, 1776, Washington gathered nearly 30,000 Continental soldiers on the Commons in Lower Manhattan and had the Declaration of Independence read aloud to them. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. The words self-evident truths, unalienable rights, the consent of the governed, moved through the assembled ranks like a current. The soldiers were no longer fighting for an abstract idea. They were fighting for a country that now had a name. That night, the mood translated itself into action. A crowd of soldiers and citizens moved down Broadway to Bowling Green, where a gilded lead statue of King George III sat on a stone pedestal. It had been erected 6 years earlier to mark the repeal of the Stamp Act, a gesture of imperial goodwill that now seemed a very long time ago. Ropes were attached. The statue came down. The pieces were eventually sent to Connecticut, where they were melted and cast into more than 40,000 musket balls. Washington noted the incident in his diary the following day and expressed measured disapproval, not of the sentiment, but of the method. He believed such things should be left to proper authority. It was a revealing distinction. Washington understood that a revolution, to survive, had to become a state, and states governed themselves by rules even in the middle of wars. The men who pulled down that statue were celebrating independence. Washington was already thinking about how to keep it. While all of this unfolded in New York, a fleet was assembling off the coast that defied easy description. 30 British warships and 400 transport vessels arrived at Sandy Hook in late June, sailing past the lighthouse and into the waters off Staten Island. A Maryland private who watched them come in later wrote that he thought all of London was afloat. The masts and rigging stretched across the horizon further than the eye could follow. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, and it was anchored within sight of the city Washington had sworn to defend. The Howe brothers, General William Howe commanding the army, Admiral Richard Howe commanding the fleet, had been given an unusual dual mandate. They were authorized to fight, but they were also authorized to make peace. Parliament believed there was still a loyal majority in the colonies that could be activated with the right offer. Richard Howe sent a letter to Washington offering pardons to patriots who would stand down. Washington refused. The only people coming from Europe, he had already told his officers, were Hessian soldiers. He was right. Within weeks, the negotiations were over and the hammer fell. When the British landed on Long Island on the 22nd of August, 1776, they did so without immediate resistance. Flatboats carried the first wave across from Staten Island to the long beach at Gravesend Bay on the southwestern tip of Long Island. Clinton and Cornwallis led the advance. The crossing took hours. By the end of it, 15,000 British and Hessian troops were ashore, with more still coming. Washington watched from across the East River and tried to read what it meant. The terrain of Long Island gave the Americans one natural advantage. Between the British landing grounds and Brooklyn Heights ran a long wooded ridge called the Gowanus Heights, a 6-mile spine of elevated ground that an army moving north would have to cross. Through this ridge ran 4 passes, each a natural corridor. Washington's commanders fortified 3 of them. Martent's Lane Pass, Flatbush Pass, and Bedford Pass were each held by Continental troops. The 4th pass, Jamaica Pass, lay at the far eastern end of the line, 5 miles from Brooklyn, seldom used and difficult to reach. General Israel Putnam, in command of the Long Island defenses, did not believe Jamaica Pass needed serious attention. It was too far, too obscure, too rarely traveled. He posted 5 mounted militia officers there to observe the road and report any movement, 5 men, on an open road, against an army of 20,000. The decision was not negligent in the way that carelessness is negligent. It was negligent in the way that overconfidence is, the assumption that an enemy will do what you expect and not what you fear. The Americans had another problem that no amount of fortification could solve. They lacked cavalry. Washington had dismissed 400 Connecticut volunteer horsemen weeks earlier. There was not enough fodder to sustain their horses, and the men refused to dismount and serve as infantry. Without cavalry, an army fighting in wooded, unfamiliar terrain has no eyes beyond its own picket lines. It cannot track enemy movement, cannot verify reports, cannot confirm what it suspects. Washington's intelligence on Long Island was, in effect, whatever his foot soldiers could see from fixed positions. The British had no such limitation. General Henry Clinton, aggressive and precise where Howe was measured, had been gathering intelligence on the American positions since the landing. His source was the loyalist population of Long Island. Farmers, innkeepers, and merchants who knew every road and pass in the county and who had reason to want the British to succeed. 3 of them approached Clinton in the days before the battle and told him about Jamaica Pass. They offered to guide his troops through it in the dark. Clinton brought the plan to Howe. It was bold. 10,000 men on a night march through terrain they did not know, guided by men whose loyalty could not be verified, aimed at a pass that might or might not be adequately defended. If the guides were wrong or untrustworthy, the column could walk into an ambush. If the Americans had reinforced the pass since the Loyalists had last observed it, the entire flanking movement could collapse. Howe weighed it and agreed. The risk of the plan was real. The risk of not using it, a frontal assault against fortified American positions, was something Howe feared far more. The plan had 3 parts moving simultaneously. General James Grant would lead 5,000 men along Gowanus Road on the western coast, pressing against the American right flank under Lord Stirling. His task was not to break through, but to fix Stirling's attention, to make Americans believe the main assault was coming from the west. Simultaneously, the Hessian general Leopold von Heister would move his 4,000 men toward Flatbush Pass in the center, shelling the American positions and keeping Sullivan's force pinned and occupied. Neither Grant nor von Heister was meant to achieve a breakthrough. They were meant to hold the Americans in place while the real blow fell elsewhere. The real blow was Clinton's column. 10,000 men, light infantry, grenadiers, Highlanders, dragoons, with Cornwallis commanding the reserve and Howe himself following with the main body, would march east along back roads after dark, loop around the far end of the American line, and pass through Jamaica Pass before dawn. Once through, they would march west behind the Heights of Guan and take the entire American outer line from the rear. Sullivan's men and Stirling's men, fighting Grant and von Heister in front, would suddenly find 10,000 soldiers behind them. The trap would be complete. At 9 o'clock on the evening of the 26th of August, the column moved out. No torches, no drums. The men had been ordered to silence. Behind them, the campfires at Flatbush continued to burn, left deliberately to suggest that the British were still encamped where the Americans last saw them. Any American observer looking south from the Heights of Guan that night would have seen firelight and assumed the enemy was at rest. The column moving east through the darkness was invisible to anyone who was not standing in its path. The route took them along roads that a tavern keeper named William Howard and his son were compelled to navigate for the column at gunpoint. Howard knew every turn. The British moved in good order through the warm August night, keeping to the back roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares where American patrols might be operating. The march covered roughly 9 miles of rough terrain in darkness. For hours, nothing went wrong. The pass came closer with each step, and still no alarm had been raised. At around 9:30 that evening, the advance guard reached the Howard Tavern near the entrance to Jamaica Pass. The 5 American militia officers stationed there were still at their post. They heard movement in the darkness and, in the confusion of the night, assumed the approaching soldiers were American. They were taken without a single shot fired. Clinton interrogated them on the spot. He asked how many men were guarding the pass. They told him the truth. They were the only ones. The door was open. 10,000 men walked through it. By 3 in the morning on the 27th of August, the lead elements of Clinton's column were through the pass and moving west behind the American lines. Howe ordered the troops to halt and rest before the signal was given. The men lay down in the fields in the darkness, waiting. Ahead of them, unaware that anything had changed, the American outer line was still facing south, watching Grant's campfires, listening for movement at the passes they had fortified, holding positions that were about to become irrelevant. On the American side, the night had been uneasy without being alarming. At just after midnight, Grant's column began moving along Gowanus Road and skirmishing with Patriot pickets near the Red Lion Tavern. The firing woke Putnam, who sent orders to Lord Stirling to advance his forces and meet Grant's pressure. Stirling moved. This was precisely what Howe needed. Stirling's attention and energy pulled toward the west, away from the east, away from the pass that was already taken and the column that was already behind him. Washington crossed the East River from Manhattan in the early morning hours and took up a position on Cobble Hill where he could observe the fighting. He had been told of Grant's advance in the night. He had not yet been told about Jamaica Pass. The reports reaching him described pressure on the right and activity at the center, a pattern consistent with a frontal assault across the heights. It was, in every visible respect, the battle he had prepared for. What he could not see was the 10,000 men who were no longer in front of him. Colonel Samuel Miles, commanding 2 battalions of Pennsylvania riflemen assigned to watch the eastern end of the line, had grown increasingly alarmed through the night. His scouts had reported unusual British movement toward Flatlands, the easternmost village in the British encampment, and he had told Sullivan that the principal attack might be coming from the east, not the center. Sullivan had no troops to spare and took no action. Miles was still in his position as dawn approached, trying to make sense of what was happening, when he spotted the rear of Howe's column emerging from the pass behind the American line. He sent half his men west to warn the main force. He was already too late. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the 27th, Howe fired 2 signal guns. They were the sound the entire British force had been waiting for. Grant pressed hard against Stirling from the west. Von Heister's Hessians advanced at the double against Sullivan's center, and Clinton's 10,000 men rested and in position began moving west from behind the American line. In the space of minutes, every American commander on the heights of Guan understood the same thing. The battle they thought they were fighting was not the battle that was happening. The most dangerous attack is not the one aimed at your strength. It is the one aimed at where you are not looking. The Americans had fortified 3 passes with everything they had. They had watched Grant's fires all night and heard his skirmishing at dawn and moved their best troops to meet him. None of it mattered. The pass they had not fortified, the road they had not watched, the column they had never seen, those were the things that decided the battle before. It was an hour old. What happened next in the fields and woods of Brooklyn on the morning of the 27th of August, 1776, was not a contest in any meaningful sense. It was a catastrophe, sudden, overwhelming, and operating on several fronts simultaneously. The men on the American outer line did not break because they were cowards. They broke because there was no direction left to hold. The 27th of August, 1776, arrived clear and warm. The kind of summer morning that, in any other year, would have meant work in the fields, trade on the docks, children running between farmhouses. On Long Island in the late summer of that year, it meant something else entirely. By the time most men on the American outer line had eaten and taken their posts, the largest battle of the Revolutionary War was already several hours old and already lost. Grant had been pushing against Lord Stirling's position along Gowanus Road since just after midnight, skirmishing through the darkness with Patriot pickets near the Red Lion Tavern. The firing was steady but not overwhelming, the kind of pressure that kept men alert and facing one direction. Stirling read it as the opening of a major assault and moved his forces forward to meet it. This was the intended response. Stirling was brave, experienced, and exactly where Howe needed him to be. Washington crossed the East River from Manhattan at around 8 in the morning and took up a position at a redoubt on Cobble Hill, where he could observe the fighting across the heights of Guan. From where he stood, the battle looked like what he had prepared for: pressure on the right, Hessian artillery active at the center, the line holding. He had no way of knowing that behind the ridge, 10,000 British soldiers were already moving west through Bedford Village toward the rear of that same line. The signal came at 9 o'clock. 2 heavy cannon shots fired in sequence from Howe's position, the sound every British commander had been waiting for since the column left camp the previous evening. Grant intensified his assault from the west. Von Heister's Hessians, who had been shelling Sullivan's position at Flatbush Pass throughout the morning, sent their light infantry forward at the double. And from behind, from the east, from the direction no American had been watching, Clinton's column began its advance. Sullivan's men at Flatbush Pass heard the guns in front and the guns behind and understood what it meant. The passes they had been ordered to hold were now surrounded. Units from Bedford Pass pulled back without orders, the decision made in an instant by men who could see what was happening more clearly than their commanders could. The American center disintegrated, not from cowardice but from arithmetic. There was no position to hold. There was no direction that was not already compromised. Sullivan moved through the chaos trying to impose order on a situation that had passed the point where order was possible. He was captured in a cornfield by 3 Hessian grenadiers in the early afternoon, not in combat, not running, but trying to hold his men together in ground that had already been overrun. His capture ended the organized resistance at the center. The men who could still move made for Brooklyn Heights as fast as the terrain would allow. Colonel Samuel Miles, the Pennsylvania officer who had warned Sullivan about Jamaica Pass the previous day, found himself in the worst position of all. When Grant attacked from the west, Miles had moved his riflemen in that direction to support the line, a sound decision based on the situation as he understood it. Then word came that Jamaica Pass was no longer defended at all, and he was ordered back. He arrived too late. He spotted the rear of Howe's column still moving through the pass and understood exactly what it meant. He sent half his men to warn the main line. He attacked the British baggage train with the other half. Nearly all of them were captured, Miles included. Washington, watching from Cobble Hill, could see the outer line coming apart. He had ridden down toward the fighting and spoken to the men as they scrambled back, telling them that the time had come when Americans must be freemen or slaves, that the choice was in their hands. The words were true. They were not enough. The battle had not been decided by words or by courage. It had been decided 2 nights earlier, in the darkness of a pass that 5 men had been assigned to guard. The Hessian advance through Flatbush Pass was conducted with a ferocity that left a mark on every account of the battle. The mercenary troops from the German states of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau were professional soldiers in the fullest sense, trained, disciplined, and operating according to European conventions of war that left little room for quarter in the heat of an assault. Sullivan's men, who could not reach Brooklyn Heights in time, found themselves in open ground with nowhere to go. Many were taken prisoner. Many others did not survive the encounter. The men who escaped the center and left did so in broken groups, cutting through woods and crossing marshes, abandoning weapons and equipment as they ran. The road to Brooklyn Heights was a gauntlet. British flanking parties had moved ahead of the retreating Americans in several places, cutting off the most direct routes. Men who had been soldiers for a day found themselves navigating terrain they did not know, chased by an army that knew it well, toward fortifications that might or might not still be holding. On the western end of the line, Lord Stirling still had not broken. He had been fighting Grant for hours, holding his ground against a force that outnumbered him significantly, convinced until well into the morning that he was engaged with the main British assault. When word reached him that Clinton's column was behind the American line and moving toward Brooklyn Heights, Stirling faced the same calculation every commander on the field faced that morning: retreat or be surrounded. He chose neither immediately for everyone. Stirling saw that if his entire force turned and ran for Brooklyn Heights at once, Grant's column would be on their backs before half of them reached safety. The Gowanus Creek, a tidal salt marsh roughly 80 yards wide, lay between his position and the heights. Men would have to cross it under fire, and there was only one way enough of them could survive that crossing: if someone held Grant's advance long enough to give them time. Stirling turned to the 1st Maryland Regiment. What happened next is the subject of the next act, but it is worth pausing here, before that story begins, to take the measure of what the morning had already produced. In the space of roughly 4 hours, the outer American line, 4 miles of fortified ridgeline held by nearly 3,000 men, had been flanked, enveloped, and destroyed. Sullivan was a prisoner. Miles was a prisoner. The center was gone, the left was going, and on the western flank, 400 men from Maryland were about to make a decision that the rest of the Army's survival depended on. Washington was still watching from the heights. He had no cavalry to send, no reserves positioned to plug the breach, no flanking force of his own to threaten the British column. He had a redoubt and a view, and the knowledge that he had been completely outgeneraled. What he did with the next 48 hours, the decision he had not yet made, the plan that did not yet exist, would determine whether the morning's catastrophe became the end of the revolution or merely its darkest hour. The battle of the 27th of August did not end with a final stand or a dramatic charge. It ended in the way that most military defeats end, gradually, in pieces, as the weight of what had happened settled over the field. Men stopped fighting not because they chose to, but because there was nothing left to fight for or from. Brooklyn Heights still stood. The fortifications still held. Behind those walls, the remnants of the Continental Army gathered in silence, watching the British dig their siege lines and waiting. The Declaration of Independence had been signed 54 days earlier. It had been read to these same men 3 weeks before. The document that named self-evident truths and unalienable rights was, at this precise moment, defended by a broken army behind earthworks on a narrow peninsula with a river at its back and 20,000 British soldiers in front of it. What the revolution required now was not courage. Courage had already been spent in quantities that would never be fully counted. What it required was something harder to find, a way out. The 1st Maryland Regiment had arrived in New York City only 2 weeks before the battle. They had crossed from Manhattan to Long Island on the evening of the 26th of August, the same night the British column was moving silently through Jamaica Pass to reinforce the forward American line. Most of them were young. Some had never fired a weapon in combat. Their colonel, William Smallwood, was absent that day, attending a court-martial hearing in the city. Command of the regiment fell to Major Mordecai Gist, a 33-year-old Baltimore merchant who had been drilling these men since the companies were first formed 2 years earlier. They had performed well in the early hours of the battle. Positioned on the western flank under Lord Stirling, they had held their ground against Grant's sustained pressure along Gowanus Road, steady, disciplined, refusing to break while the rest of the line was coming apart to the east. One soldier wrote a letter days after the battle describing the moment the British advanced. The men drew up in line and offered battle in what he called the true English taste. They were not yet broken, they were not yet surrounded, and then, around midday, the situation changed entirely. Word reached Stirling that Clinton's column had passed through Jamaica Pass hours earlier and was now behind the American line, moving toward Brooklyn Heights from the east. Grant was pressing hard from the west. Von Heister's Hessians were advancing through the center, In every direction that mattered, the British were either present or arriving. Sterling looked at his position and understood that if he ordered a general retreat across Gowanus Creek, Grant would be on the backs of his men before most of them reached the far bank. Someone had to stay. Gowanus Creek was not a river in any conventional sense. It was a tidal salt marsh, roughly 80 yards of dark, brackish water and sucking mud, with the tide running fast and no bridge left standing. The bridge had been destroyed earlier to slow any British advance. Men would have to swim it or wade through the marsh under fire. The far bank and the relative safety of Brooklyn Heights was visible from where Sterling stood. Between his men and that bank was the creek, and between the creek and his men was Cornwallis's column, which had already moved to occupy the Vechte Cortelyou house, an old Dutch stone farmhouse on the southwestern edge of the marsh, and was firing into the Americans from its walls and grounds. Sterling ordered the bulk of his force to begin crossing immediately. Then he turned to Gist and the Marylanders. There were roughly 260 of them left. The name Maryland 400 came later, a tribute that grew larger than the number it described. Sterling told Gist what was needed. Hold Cornwallis at the old stone house long enough for the others to cross. Charge the British position. Buy time. Sterling himself would stay and fight alongside them rather than cross to safety while his men held the line. Gist led the first charge at the old stone house. 2,000 British troops were positioned in and around the building with artillery support. The Marylanders came at them across open ground. They were driven back. They formed again and charged a second time. They were driven back again. The men who had survived the first charge reformed for the third without being ordered to. They understood what they were doing and what it was costing. They did it anyway. The charges continued. The accounts vary between 5 and 6, the number less important than the fact that each one was made by men who had already survived the one before it and knew what the next one would bring. At one point during the fighting, Gist's force briefly secured the building and took prisoners. Cornwallis rallied his troops, and the Marylanders were driven out again. The old stone house changed hands in the smoke and noise of an engagement that had no path to victory, only the path of buying minutes for the men crossing the marsh behind them. Washington watched from the redoubt on Cobble Hill. He could see the Marylanders charging across the open ground toward the stone house. He could see them driven back and reform and charge again. The accounts that survive describe him gripping the earthwork in front of him, watching men die at a distance close enough to see their faces but too far to do anything about it. What he said in that moment was recorded by those standing near him. "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." It was not a general's calculation. It was the utterance of a man watching other men spend themselves so that an army and a revolution could survive. The Marylanders were not fighting for a position that could be held. They were not fighting for ground that had any meaning after that day. They were fighting to give the men crossing the marsh behind them enough time to reach the far bank. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The crossing of Gowanus Creek was its own ordeal. Men went into the water under fire, some in good order, some in desperate scrambles. The marsh was deeper in places than it looked. Men who could not swim went under. Men who were struck by fire in the water were lost. Some were pulled out by the men ahead of them. Some were not. The tide was running. The mud held boots and pulled men down. On the far bank, those who had crossed turned to watch the others still coming, and beyond them the smoke of the old stone house. Sterling himself was the last to cross, or tried to be. He was surrounded before he could reach the water. Unwilling to surrender to the British troops pressing around him, he broke through their line and gave himself up to the Hessian general von Heister instead, a distinction that mattered to him for reasons that speak to the pride of a man who had held his ground as long as ground could be held. He was taken prisoner. He would be exchanged months later and would fight again. The men who had charged with him would not all have that chance. After the sixth and final charge, Gist pulled back with what remained of his command and crossed the creek. He made it. 10 others made it back to the American lines with him. Behind them, 256 Marylanders had fallen in the fields around the old stone house, the highest regimental losses of any unit in the entire Revolutionary War. More than 100 had been captured. Fewer than a dozen had escaped. The regiment that had arrived 2 weeks earlier, full and disciplined and untested, had been reduced to a handful of survivors in a single afternoon. The Marylanders had done what they were asked to do. The bulk of Sterling's force had crossed the marsh. The British at the old stone house had been held long enough. The men who reached Brooklyn Heights were battered and broken and exhausted, but they were alive, and they were still in the war. The charges at the old stone house had bought those men the minutes they needed. The cost of those minutes was counted in the fields by the creek, where the grass was thick with the fallen. Washington later referred to the Maryland regiments as his old line, the steady, reliable core around which everything else was built. The name eventually became the nickname of the state itself. Maryland is still called the Old Line State. It is a name that comes from a single afternoon in Brooklyn, from a charge made 6 times against a position that could not be taken by men who knew it could not be taken and charged it anyway. What the Maryland 400 did at the old stone house is not remembered the way that other moments of the Revolution are remembered. They did not win. They did not hold the position. They did not change the outcome of the battle, which was already decided before they made their first charge. What they did was simpler and harder than any of that. They chose, without orders compelling them to choose it, to spend themselves so that others could live. In a battle defined by intelligence failures and strategic errors and the weight of overwhelming force, theirs was the one decision that was entirely and irreducibly human. The British that evening dug siege lines in front of Brooklyn Heights and settled in to wait. They had won the field completely. They had taken Sullivan and Sterling prisoner. They had driven the Continental Army behind its last line of fortifications with the East River at its back. General Putnam, surveying the men who had made it back, was reported to have said that he did not know how any of them had survived. Washington, standing among the survivors in the fading light of the 27th of August, knew that surviving was not the same as being safe. He had perhaps 48 hours before the British completed their siege lines and pressed the final assault. He had no plan yet. He had an army that had just been broken, and he had the memory of what he had watched from that redoubt, the charges, the smoke, the men at the creek, to carry with him into whatever came next. There is a small monument in Brooklyn today, near where the old stone house still stands, rebuilt on its original foundations using the original stones. It is not a famous landmark. Most people who pass it do not know what happened there. The men buried in the fields around it were never recovered. A metal sign at an American Legion post marks the approximate location of their remains. They were 20 years old, most of them. They had been soldiers for 2 weeks. They had come from Maryland, which is a long way from Brooklyn, and they had charged a stone farmhouse 6 times in a single afternoon and made it possible for a revolution to continue. That is the whole of what they did. It was enough. Some men spend their lives so that others may continue. The Maryland 400 were not the only ones who did this across the long years of the Revolutionary War. But they did it first, at the moment when it mattered most, in the largest battle of the conflict, before any of the victories that would come later had made the outcome seem inevitable. They did not know that the revolution would be won. They only knew what was happening in front of them, at the old stone house, in the last hours of the 27th of August, 1776. They chose to hold, they held. The rest of the army crossed the creek. That is what it cost. That is what it bought. Mordecai Gist survived. He went on to fight at Trenton and Princeton, at Camden and Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, and he was present at Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered. The same Cornwallis whose troops had occupied the old stone house and fired on the men, crossing Gowanus Creek on that August afternoon. John Trumbull painted the surrender at Yorktown, and Gist appears in the background of that painting, which now hangs in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. He is not in the foreground. He is not the central figure. He is simply there, as he was at Long Island, doing what was needed in the place where it had to be done. The Battle of the 27th of August, 1776, was over. The Continental Army was broken, contained, and apparently finished. 20,000 British soldiers were digging siege lines 50 yards from the last American fortification on Long Island. The East River was behind Washington's men, and the British Navy controlled the water. By every calculation available to any observer on either side of that creek, the revolution was over. What happened next, what Washington decided in the 2 days of rain that followed, is the reason it was not. On the afternoon of the 27th of August, 1776, William Howe stood on the high ground his army had taken and looked north toward Brooklyn Heights. What he saw was not a mystery. The Continental Army, what remained of it, was crowded behind earthworks on a narrow peninsula with the East River at its back. His brother's fleet controlled the water, his own army outnumbered the Americans significantly, and had spent the morning proving it could move and fight with precision. Every officer around him could see the same thing. The battle was not over. It could be finished today. Howe did not finish it. He ordered his men to halt their advance, begin constructing siege lines, and prepare for a formal investment of the heights. No assault, no exploitation of the route. The British would dig in, bring up heavy artillery, and reduce the American position by the methodical procedures of European siege warfare. It would take days, perhaps longer, but it would be done properly, with British lives protected and the outcome made certain before a single grenadier climbed an American earthwork. His officers were not unanimous in their approval. General Henry Clinton, who had designed the flanking march and led the column through Jamaica Pass, understood better than most what the afternoon had produced and what it still offered. He had watched the American lines collapse. He had seen the chaos at Gowanus Creek and the broken men streaming into the heights. Clinton recorded his frustration without ambiguity. He believed that had the British pressed forward immediately to the ferry landing on the East River, everything on the island would have been lost for the Americans. The moment, he wrote, was there. Howe did not take it. Israel Putnam, the American commander at Brooklyn Heights, understood it from the other side. When Howe stopped and the British siege lines began to rise instead of a charging assault, Putnam looked at what was happening and said the words that would follow Howe for the rest of his life and beyond it. "General Howe," Putnam said, "is either our friend or no general." It was not a compliment. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has been granted a mercy he did not expect and does not entirely believe. The question of why Howe stopped has occupied historians for 2.5 centuries. Several explanations exist, and none of them fully cancels the others. His troops had marched through the night and fought through the morning. They were exhausted, operating on momentum and adrenaline, and a frontal assault on fortified heights by men in that condition carried its own risks. The Brooklyn Heights fortifications were substantial, built over months rather than hours, and the Americans behind them still had artillery. A broken army in a prepared position is not the same as a broken army in the open field. Howe also told Parliament in 1779, 3 years later, defending his conduct of the entire campaign, that his essential duty was to avoid excessive British casualties for insufficient purpose. Capturing Brooklyn Heights, he argued, would likely not have meant capturing the entire American army. The Americans could still have escaped to Manhattan. The loss of 1,000 or 1,500 British soldiers, in his calculation, would have been poorly repaid even by double that number of American casualties. The arithmetic, he said, did not favor the assault. The arithmetic was not wrong. But the arithmetic was not the whole of it. To understand why Howe stopped at Brooklyn Heights, you have to go back 14 months to a hill outside Boston on the 17th of June, 1775, where William Howe had led British regulars up a fortified slope and watched more than 1,000 of his men fall in the space of an afternoon. Bunker Hill, fought mostly on Breed's Hill, the name a small irony that history kept, was a British victory in the narrowest possible sense. The Americans were driven off, the position was taken. But the cost, 1,054 British casualties in a single engagement, including 89 officers, the highest officer loss rate the British Army suffered in any battle of the entire war. Howe had led the assault personally. He had watched his men cut down at close range by colonial militia, who, by every European military convention, should not have been capable of holding that ground. He had been seen standing alone on that hill, surrounded by the fallen, with an expression that those nearby described without comfort. What Bunker Hill did to Howe as a commander is not something that appears in his official dispatches. It appears instead in the pattern of his decisions for the rest of the war. in the systematic avoidance of frontal assaults against American fortified positions, in the preference for maneuver over shock, in the hesitation at moments when speed and violence might have ended the rebellion but would certainly have cost British lives in large numbers. After Bunker Hill, the British never again launched a major frontal assault against a fortified American position. The lesson had been learned at a price that Howe was not prepared to pay twice. The Brooklyn Heights fortifications had been under construction for months. They were, by any assessment, far stronger than the hastily built earthworks on Breed's Hill that had cost so many British lives. Howe knew it. His decision to lay siege rather than assault was, in the terms of his own experience and his own fear, entirely rational. Rational and catastrophic are not mutually exclusive. Howe's caution at Brooklyn Heights was the product of real knowledge about real costs. It was also the decision that gave Washington the time he needed. Past trauma shapes future choices in ways that can be invisible until they cost you everything. Howe carried Bunker Hill into every decision he made for the rest of the war, and what he carried turned out to be the weight that tipped the balance against him at the moment that mattered most. The 28th of August brought rain. A northeast wind had been rising since the previous afternoon, and by evening it had backed fully around and strengthened into a sustained storm that drove cold rain across Brooklyn and churned the East River into rough water. Admiral Richard Howe's fleet, waiting in the harbor for the wind to shift so it could move into the East River and seal the Americans in from the water, found itself unable to move. The very weather that made the American position more miserable also kept the Navy from completing the encirclement. On the British side of the lines, the siege works continued in the rain, trenches were dug, artillery was moved forward into position. The methodical machinery of a European siege, the same machinery that had reduced fortresses across the continent for a century, ground forward. Through the mud toward Brooklyn Heights, Howe's men had no reason to hurry. The Americans were going nowhere. The fleet would enter the river when the wind allowed. The siege lines would reach the American earthworks in due course. The revolution would end not with a charge but with a surrender. What Howe did not know, what no one on the British side of the lines knew, was that Washington had called a council of war on the night of the 28th and was already planning something that no one on either side of the East River believed was possible. The siege lines, the storm, the fleet waiting in the harbor, all of it, in Howe's calculation, up to a trap with no exit. He was right about the trap. He had not yet discovered that Washington had found the one door he had left open, not by design, but by the same caution that had stopped him at the edge of Brooklyn Heights. The door was the river itself. Howe's fleet controlled the harbor and the approaches to the East River from the south. But the wind that had backed around to the northeast on the evening of the 27th had kept the fleet out of the East River for 2 full days. The water between Brooklyn and Manhattan, the water Howe had assumed would seal the Americans in, was, for those 2 days, open. It was not a wide window, it was not a comfortable one, but it was there, and Washington was already looking at it. The lesson that Howe's decision at Brooklyn Heights carries is not simply that caution is dangerous, or that generals who hesitate lose wars. It is more specific and more uncomfortable than that. Howe was haunted by Bunker Hill in a way that was completely understandable. He had seen what frontal assaults against prepared American positions cost, and he was not willing to see it again. That memory was accurate. That experience was real. And yet the very thing that made him a careful and responsible commander, the refusal to repeat a costly mistake, became the instrument of a larger and more consequential one. A man who cannot act because of what he has already seen is not in command of the present. He is in command of the past. Howe was fighting Brooklyn Heights through the lens of Bunker Hill, and in doing so he gave Washington 2 days. 2 days of rain and siege lines, and fleet-stopping wind, to find a way out of a trap that should have had no exit. The decision not to press the assault on the 27th of August, 1776, was the most consequential single decision of the entire New York campaign, perhaps of the entire war. By the morning of the 29th, the British siege lines were closer. The wind was beginning to ease. Admiral Howe's fleet would be able to move into the East River within hours, perhaps a day. The window that the storm had held open was closing. Washington knew it. He had spent the previous night making a plan that depended on the river, on darkness, on silence, and on a regiment of Massachusetts fishermen who knew how to handle boats in rough water. What he was about to attempt had never been done before, not at this scale, not under these conditions, not with this much depending on it going right. Washington had not slept in 2 days, neither had most of his officers. The men in the trenches at Brooklyn Heights had been rotating through sleepless watches since the 27th, listening to the British dig their siege lines closer through the rain, watching the darkness for movement that might signal the assault everyone knew was coming. By the evening of the 29th of August, the army behind those earthworks was exhausted in the particular way that combines physical depletion with the accumulated weight of a catastrophe that has not yet finished arriving. Washington called his council of war on the evening of the 29th. The question put to his generals was not whether to fight. The outer line was gone. Sullivan and Sterling were prisoners, and the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights could not hold indefinitely against the siege works. The British were advancing through the mud. The question was whether retreat across the East River was possible before the British fleet entered the water and sealed the encirclement. The generals voted to try. The plan that followed was the most demanding operation the Continental Army had yet attempted, and it had to be executed in darkness, in silence, in a single night. Washington had begun collecting boats days earlier, under cover of a story that reinforcements were coming from New Jersey and supplies needed to be moved. Quartermasters had gathered every flat-bottomed boat, every sailboat, every vessel that could carry men and equipment across a mile of open water. The deception extended to the orders given to some units. They were told they were moving to new positions, not crossing a river. The intention of the evacuation was so carefully concealed that many soldiers did not understand what they were doing until they were already at the water's edge. Colonel John Glover and the 14th Continental Regiment, the Marblehead Mariners, fishermen and sailors from the coast of Massachusetts, were brought across from Manhattan to Brooklyn on the 28th, ostensibly as reinforcements. They were the only men in Washington's army who could handle boats in rough water in the dark with the precision and quietness that the crossing required. Glover's men knew currents and tides and the language of moving water in ways that soldiers from inland counties did not. Washington needed exactly that knowledge on exactly that night. At 10 o'clock on the evening of the 29th, the withdrawal began. The plan called for the frontline regiments to pull back first, quietly relieved by rear guard units who would hold the trenches until the last possible moment. Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin commanded the Pennsylvania rear guard, the men who would remain in the trenches while the rest of the army moved to the ferry, who would be the last to leave, who would be in the greatest danger if anything went wrong. Mifflin's men took their posts without complaint. They understood what the assignment meant. The movement to the ferry was conducted in near total silence. No drums, no spoken orders above a whisper, no lanterns. 9,000 men, along with horses, artillery pieces, ammunition, and supplies, moved through the darkness from the trenches to the water in a column that stretched back through Brooklyn Heights. Every sound that might carry across the water to the British lines was suppressed. Soldiers were told that any man who made noise would answer for it. The night was still. The water was, as one soldier later wrote, as smooth as glass. Glover's boats went back and forth across the East River through the night. Each crossing took time. The river was more than a mile wide. The current was running, and the boats could carry only so many men at once. Artillery pieces had to be maneuvered to the water's edge and loaded without the sounds of metal on stone, carrying to British sentries 50 yards away. Horses had to be kept calm in the dark on unfamiliar ground beside open water. The operation demanded a kind of sustained collective discipline that this army had not previously demonstrated. It held. By midnight, regiments were crossing in sequence. By 2 in the morning, the evacuation was well underway, but the numbers were not working. Dawn was coming, and thousands of men were still in the trenches. The rear guard under Mifflin was still at their posts, holding a line against a British army that did not yet know there was no longer anyone behind them. If the fog held off and the light came before the last boats crossed, the rear guard would be discovered. The British siege lines would come alive. the window would close. Then something happened that every account of the evacuation struggles to describe without reaching for words that belong to a different register entirely. As dawn approached and the remaining men in the trenches began to feel the growing light of the morning with particular urgency, a dense fog rose from the surface of the East River and settled over both encampments. Not scattered mist, a wall of gray so thick that men standing 6 yards apart could not see each other. Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was among the last soldiers waiting at the trenches, recorded it in his memoirs decades later and still could not entirely account for it. Talmadge wrote that he recollected the peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, that the fog had settled in a singular manner over both the American and the British positions simultaneously, as though it had been placed there for a specific purpose. The sun rose, the fog did not lift. The boats continued to cross. Men who had been visible in the growing dawn were suddenly invisible again. The British siege lines, 50 yards away, might as well have been on another continent. The rear guard held its silence, held its posts, and waited for the order to move. Mifflin's rear guard received their order and pulled back from the trenches. They moved to the ferry in the fog, in silence, file by file, leaving the earthworks empty behind them. When the last of them reached the water, the boats were still there. Glover's men were still rowing. The crossing continued. Washington stood at the ferry, landing on the Brooklyn side, and watched each regiment go. He had been there through the night and into the morning. He did not step into a boat himself. The last boat left the Brooklyn shore with Washington aboard. Talmadge, crossing in one of the final boats, looked back and saw Washington stepping down to the water. By the time the British realized what had happened, by the time sentries reported the trenches empty and officers understood that the army they had been besieging for 2 days was gone, the last American was already on the Manhattan side of the East River. The fog was still thick over the Brooklyn shore when the British arrived at the abandoned fortifications. 9,000 men, horses, artillery, ammunition, and supplies moved across a mile of open water in darkness and fog in less than 13 hours, without the loss of a single life. The British, when they reached the empty trenches and looked out at the river, found nothing but the fog and the sound of water. One British officer, Captain George Collier of the frigate Rainbow, had written in his journal the previous day that if the British became masters of this body of rebels, the war was at an end. When the fog lifted, the body of rebels was in Manhattan. Washington later described these events using the word providence, the same word he used throughout his life, for moments when the outcome exceeded what human planning could reasonably produce. The fog was one of those moments. He did not say the fog was miraculous, he said it was providential. The distinction mattered to him. Providence, in the understanding of his era, was not the suspension of natural law. It was natural law operating in ways that served purposes beyond what men could arrange. The fog came from the river. It also came at exactly the right time. The will to survive is not the same thing as cowardice. This is the lesson that the evacuation of Long Island carries, and it is a harder lesson than it sounds, because the conditions under which Washington made the decision to retreat were conditions that would have tempted any commander toward a different choice. He had just suffered the largest defeat in the history of the Continental Army. He was under siege. His men were broken and exhausted. The army that had just destroyed his outer line was 50 yards away. Pride and the fear of what retreat would look like pulled in one direction. The survival of the revolution pulled in another. Washington chose the revolution. He did not choose it easily or without cost. The evacuation required days of deception, a night of extraordinary discipline, and a fog that no one could have planned for. But the choice itself was made before any of that. It was made in the Council of War on the evening of the 29th, when Washington looked at his options and decided that the army that was still alive was worth more than the position it was defending. He was right. Every campaign that followed, Trenton, Princeton, Yorktown, was built on the foundation of that decision. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge wrote in his memoirs that in all the history of warfare he did not recollect a more fortunate retreat. He was a careful man and a precise one. He became Washington's spy master, the coordinator of intelligence networks across New York and Connecticut, a man who weighed words before he committed them to paper. When he wrote that he did not recollect a more fortunate retreat, he meant it as the highest possible praise for what Washington had achieved and the lowest possible description of what had nearly not happened. Both things were true. The retreat was fortunate. It was also one of the most precisely executed military operations of the entire Revolutionary War, and it was a retreat. The British woke on the morning of the 30th of August to empty trenches, an abandoned fortification, and a river that had been full of crossing boats all night without any of them knowing it. The fog lifted eventually. The shore was quiet. The army that General Howe had trapped against the East River was in Manhattan, intact, armed, and still in the war. The siege lines the British had spent 2 days building now enclosed nothing but mud and the memory of an army that had been there. The accounting begins with numbers, because numbers are the first language of what happened between the 27th and 30th of August, 1776. 300 Americans were killed in the battle, 800 were wounded, over 1,000 were captured, taken in the fields and passes and marshes of Brooklyn Heights, marched into British custody, and held in whatever the British could use as a prison. The British lost 64 killed and 293 wounded. In the mathematics of battle, the result was unambiguous. It was the largest defeat the Continental Army had suffered, and would suffer, in the entire Revolutionary War. New York fell. Washington held Manhattan for another 2 weeks after the evacuation from Long Island, but the outcome was already written. On the 15th of September, British forces landed at Kip's Bay on the eastern shore of Manhattan, and the Continental Army abandoned the city. The British occupied New York from that day until the 25th of November, 1783, 7 years of occupation, through the entire remainder of the war. The city that John Adams had called the key to the whole continent was in British hands throughout every campaign, every victory, and every turning point of the revolution that followed. The men who had been captured at Long Island entered a world that is one of the least remembered chapters of the Revolutionary War. The British, quickly running short of space on land, began anchoring decommissioned ships in Wallabout Bay on the Brooklyn shore of the East River, stripped out hulks that became floating prisons in conditions that no account adequately conveys. The most notorious was the HMS Jersey, known among the prisoners simply as Hell. Disease moved through the holds without check. The mortality was devastating. By the end of the war, more than 11,000 Americans had perished aboard the prison ships, a number that exceeds all battlefield deaths of the Revolutionary War combined. The men who died in those holds had not run at Long Island. Many of them had fought in the fields of Gowanus, in the passes of the heights of Guan, at the fords and marshes of a battle that lasted 1 day and cost them everything that came after. They are the least visible part of what the defeat at Long Island produced. The Maryland 400 are remembered imperfectly. Washington's evacuation is celebrated. The men on the prison ships have a monument in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, built over the remains that washed up on the shore for years after the war ended and are otherwise largely absent from the histories that surround them. Washington retreated through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania through the autumn of 1776, with the Continental Army dissolving around him. Enlistments expired, men deserted, whole companies walked home. By the time he crossed the Delaware River in December, the army that had crossed the East River from Long Island in August had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 effective soldiers. Thomas Paine, who had been with the army during the retreat, wrote the words that fixed that moment in the historical memory of the Revolution. These are the times that try men's souls. They were. What Washington did with those souls, with that remnant of an army that had no reason to believe it could still win anything, is the measure of what Long Island had taught him. On the night of the 25th of December, 1776, he crossed the Delaware River again, this time moving toward the enemy rather than away from it. The Marblehead mariners, who had rowed his army off Long Island in August, rowed it across the Delaware in December. Glover's men were at the oars again. What followed, the attack at Trenton, the maneuver at Princeton, were not the actions of the same commander who had left Jamaica Pass with 5 men guarding it. The lesson Long Island had delivered was specific and permanent. Washington wrote it to John Hancock in September of 1776, in plain language. The war should on all occasions be defensive. He should avoid a general action and put nothing to the risk unless compelled by necessity. The army was the revolution. If the army was destroyed, the revolution ended. Preserving the army was not a retreat from the cause, it was the cause expressed in military terms. Every future decision Washington made in the field was built on that understanding, learned at Long Island at a cost that could not be recovered. Howe took Philadelphia the following year, the same maneuver, the same flanking movement at Brandywine Creek, the same tactical brilliance, producing the same strategic hollowness. Philadelphia fell in September of 1777. The Continental Congress fled, the city was occupied, and nothing changed. The revolution did not collapse because Philadelphia fell, for the same reason it had not collapsed when New York fell, because Washington had understood by then that cities were not the revolution. The army was, and the army was still in the field. Saratoga came in October of 1777, the British Northern campaign that Howe had fatally weakened by taking his army to Philadelphia instead of moving north to support Burgoyne. Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. France entered the war on the American side. The entire strategic character of the conflict shifted. None of it would have been possible if Washington had not evacuated Long Island in August of 1776. If he had stayed and fought and lost the army in the earthworks of Brooklyn Heights rather than moving it across the river in the dark. The pattern that Howe had established at Long Island, tactical brilliance undermined by strategic indecision, ran through the rest of the war like a thread. He had the flanking movement, he won the ground. He did not destroy the army, he had the city, he did not hold the continent. He was recalled to England in 1778 after Saratoga, replaced by Henry Clinton. The qualities that had made him a devastating battlefield commander, the planning, the intelligence work, the use of loyalist networks, the night march through Jamaica Pass, were never matched by an equivalent understanding of what winning the battle was supposed to produce. Washington carried Long Island differently. He did not carry it as a defeat to be avenged or a wound to be nursed. He carried it as a lesson in what the war actually was, not a series of positions to be held or cities to be defended, but a question of whether an army could be kept alive long enough for the political and diplomatic conditions of the war to shift in its favor. That understanding, shaped in the earthworks and marshes and river crossings of August 1776, was the foundation of everything that followed at Trenton, at Valley Forge, at Yorktown. The men who are remembered from Long Island are the Maryland 400 and the Marblehead Mariners, the men who charged the old stone house and the men who rode all night. Both groups were doing something that required a particular kind of courage, not the courage of certainty, but the courage of a situation that offered no good outcome, only a less bad one. The Marylanders charged a position they could not take so that others could cross a creek. Glover's men rode through the darkness so that an army could escape a trap. Neither group was fighting to win that night. They were fighting to make it possible for someone else to win later. There is a version of the Battle of Long Island that presents it as a near miraculous escape, Providence intervening through fog and storm and British hesitation to preserve the Continental Army against all probability. That version is not wrong. The fog was real, the storm was real, Howe's hesitation was real, but miracles require vessels to work through, and the vessels here were men. The fog saved the rearguard only because the rearguard was still at their posts when it came. The storm kept the British fleet out of the East River only because Washington had already decided to use the river before the storm gave it to him. The evacuation of Long Island was not luck dressed up in military language. It was preparation, deception, discipline, and the willingness to choose survival over pride, executed under conditions that would have broken a less coherent command. What the fog added was time. What the men had already added was everything else. When Talmadge wrote that he did not recollect a more fortunate retreat in all the history of warfare, he was not diminishing what Washington had done. He was naming the one element that no human planning could have provided. The rest had been provided by the men. The campfires the British had left burning on the Long Island shore on the night of the 26th of August, the fires meant to deceive the Americans into believing the column was still encamped. became a kind of emblem of the whole campaign. Deception used as a weapon, the appearance of presence where there was absence, of stasis where there was motion. Washington learned that lesson too. At the Second Battle of Trenton in January of 1777, his men left fires burning along the old line while the army slipped around. Cornwallis in the dark and marched to Princeton. The campfires were Washington's this time. He had been taught by the best. New York remained British until the 25th of November, 1783. 6 days after the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war, which itself came 2 years after Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The city was British throughout the Revolution, throughout Saratoga, throughout Valley Forge, throughout the French alliance, throughout every moment that the war turned and turned again in the Americans' favor. It was a British city when the war ended. Washington rode into it on evacuation day and gave his farewell address to his officers at Fraunce's Tavern, 11 blocks from where the statue of King George III had stood before it was pulled down in 1776. The Battle of Long Island is the story of 3 decisions made in 48 hours that each carried a lesson the Revolution could not afford to ignore. The Maryland 400 taught that some men must spend themselves so that others may continue, and that this spending, when chosen freely, is its own form of victory. Howe taught that past trauma shapes present judgment in ways invisible to the man being shaped, and that the caution born of real experience can become the instrument of a larger failure. Washington taught that survival is a strategic act, and that knowing what you are preserving and being willing to lose everything else to preserve it is the thing that turns a losing army into a winning revolution. On the morning of the 30th of August, 1776, the British found empty trenches and a quiet river. The army they had spent 2 days besieging was in Manhattan. The siege lines they had built enclosed nothing. The East River, which Howe had expected to be his final seal on the trap, had been the Americans' road out. The campfires that had burned on the Long Island shore the previous night, the ones left by the rear guard as they pulled back to the water, were cold by the time the British arrived. Everything the British had counted on was there. The army they had counted on capturing was not. It was still in the war. It would remain in the war for 7 more years, and at the end of those 7 years, it would win.